Hello, and welcome back to Bumblebee, where we're experiencing extreme horrors and immense bravery with the top 10 extreme survival stories you won't believe are real. Starting with a Paramount Disaster. While filming the background footage for Sliver, a sultry X-rated mystery movie starring Sharon Stone in 1992, Paramount cameraman Michael Benson, film technician Chris Duddy, helicopter pilot Craig Hoskins spiraled and crashed into the active volcano vent at Hawaii's Volcano National Park. All three of them survived somehow, despite crashing literally only meters away from the lava pool. Craig Hoskins managed to get back to the helicopter and radio for help after a few attempts of theirs to climb out failed. He was rescued a few hours later, but Benson and Duddy had left him to try and scale the wall again, and the heavy rain, fog, and steam from the vent created a whiteout effect that made it impossible to see the other two and rescue them. A day later, as the volcano started becoming more active, Chris Duddy lost his cool. "I kind of started to panic. I didn't want to die in there," he said. "I wanted to die being an old man with my family around." This guy actually managed to climb up and out of a volcano by sticking his arms into the hot ash as he climbed and suffering from massive burns. Duddy got in contact with some rescuers, telling them where Mike Benson was. So a final rescue attempt was made. After 2 full days of being trapped inside, Benson was found and airlifted to safety. A few hours later, the volcano erupted. "The last night, I heard and saw every face of every person I'd ever known," said Benson. Sometimes people say the only way to conquer your fears are to face them. I personally wouldn't want to do that with a 33,000-foot drop. The fall gained stewardess Vesna Volvik a place in the Guinness Book of Records in 1985 for the highest fall survived without a parachute and celebrity status in her home country of Serbia. When the plane's luggage department suddenly capsized, something they've never been able to suss out as sabotage or not, the plane broke apart mid-air above Czechoslovakia. Vesna Volvik became wedged between a food cart and a wall as the plane broke into pieces and fell to the ground. The tail landed in a heavily wooded, snow-blanketed part of the mountainside, which is thought to have cushioned the impact. Against all odds, Vesna survived, and she was the only one of 28 passengers and crew to do so. Her injuries included broken legs and vertebrae, a fractured skull, and temporary paralysis. She was also comatose for part of her recovery. Vesna was rescued by Bruno Honk, a woodsman who had actually heard her screaming in the dark while debris came raining down around him. Vesna was able to walk again in less than a year after her crash, but she's never had any memory of the flight after boarding. Her first memory is seeing her parents in the hospital. Remarkably, she continued flying and even tried to get her old gig as a flight attendant back, though the airline declined on the basis of her health and provided her a desk job. And speaking of world records, meet the man who set one for 13 weeks at sea. So, Salvador Alvaguera is a Salvadorian fisherman who spent 13 months adrift at sea. He is the first person ever recorded in history to have survived in a small boat at sea for more than a year. The Guardian is actually the one sole resource that managed to get his full story. So it all started on November 17th of 2012. Jose set off on a professional fishing trip with a young fisherman named Ezequiel Cordoboa, with whom he'd never worked. They planned to be out for more than 30 hours hunting shark and tuna, and a few hours into their voyage, a storm struck that lasted 5 days and blew them into the middle of nowhere. Jose did call his boss from the ship's radio for help, but like much of the boat's electronics had been disabled by the storm. So alone and without food or supplies, the two fishermen survived by eating raw fish, turtles, and jellyfish, collecting and drinking bowls of rainwater and turtle blood. After weeks turned into months, Cordoba became severely unwell and died from the raw meat. 6 days after Cordoba's death, Jose came out of his stupor and was shocked to find he was conversing with someone long gone, and he had to make the gut-wrenching decision to slip his friend into the sea. Jose then endured another 9 months alone at sea until he eventually spotted a small island, abandoned his boat, and swam to shore. He was immediately met by a local couple, and he had reached the Marshall Islands. The couple aided in alerting authorities, and Jose made it home. He had been 6,700 miles from the place he had set out and drifted for 438 days. This story may be familiar due to its viral video rescue. In 2013, Harrison Okene was working as a cook on a tugboat off the Nigerian coast with a crew of 12 people on board. It was late at night, so all the rooms on the boat were locked. This is a security practice, as pirates often rob the boats in that region overnight. Harrison was up early and getting ready to start cooking breakfast for the crew when he felt the call of nature. It's while he's on the John that the ocean swell came out of nowhere and slammed the small boat, immediately capsizing it and sending it sinking into the ocean. The impact tossed Harrison from the toilet and he bounced around the ship. When the vessel finally settled at the bottom of the ocean, he was lucky enough to stumble into an air pocket. He managed to find 2 mattresses to stack on top of each other and stayed above the rising water in his tiny little chamber for 3 days. When the diving crew set out to collect bodies from the shipwreck, they got a hell of a shock. A living hand reached out gently from the darkness and grabbed the diver's own. The crew equipped him with a special suit and started his ascent back into life above water. He passed out on the way up, but he survived to tell his story. He spent 2 days in a decompression chamber and suffered various traumas. Even though he never wanted to go near the ocean again, Harrison abandoned his fear and became a certified commercial diver in 2015. The beauty of it is the rescue diver who discovered him is the one who presented him his diploma. And of course, you can't talk extreme survival without the Shackleton escape story. The Endurance had left South Georgia for Antarctica on December 5th of 1914 carrying 28 men. The goal of the expedition leader Shackleton was to establish a base on Antarctica's Weddell Sea coast. But by January 18th, a day away from their destination, they became lodged in the ice with no way forward or back, just being pushed farther away. Finally, on October 27, 1915, a new wave of pressure ripped across the ice, lifting the ship's stern and tearing off its rudder and keel. 25 days later, the Endurance slipped beneath the ice. They were forced to stop, camp, and wait on these ice sheets until April 7, 1916, when the snow-capped peaks of the Clarence and Elephant Islands came into view. By the 9th, the ice split beneath them and they took their escape boats. The men were exhausted, but after 6 days of rowing, they made it to the first dry land in 497 days. This dry land was abandoned though, so they still needed saving. So Shackleton and 5 others take off in a boat again for another 800-mile trip. For 16 days, they battled monstrous waters and they finally make it to the island, but on the wrong side. So they hike 36 hours until they finally reach the Stromness station. After that, it takes 3 separate ships on 3 separate attempts to finally make it back to Elephant Island and pick up the rest of the crew. It had been 128 days since Shackleton left, and 20 months after setting out for the Antarctic, everyone of the Endurance crew was alive and safe. For Julianne, her survival means she'll always remember, now it's all over. Christmas Eve 1971, and Julianne Diller and her mother Maria were traveling from Lima to Panguera, where Julianne occasionally lived with her zoologist parents who established a facility there. The flight was going well until they entered a dark cloud that Julianne describes as 10 minutes later, it was obvious something was very wrong. There was heavy turbulence, the plane was jumping up and down, parcels and luggage were falling to the floor, and other passengers began to cry and weep and scream. Then lightning hits the plane wing. Julianne hears her mother calmly remark, "That is the end. Now it's over," and remembers nothing before she regained consciousness on Christmas morning with gashes and broken bones, still strapped into her seat in the middle of the jungle. Before the crash, I'd spent over a year and a half with my parents on their research station only 30 miles away. I learned a lot about life in the rainforest, that it wasn't too dangerous. She treks past bodies and debris for days before coming across a shed with gasoline that she uses to flush the maggots out of her wounds. She spends the night in that shed, wakes up to forest workers who feed her, treat her, and brought her back to civilization. It turns out for 11 days Julianne had walked through the Amazon. The day after my rescue, I saw my father. He could barely talk in the first moment we just held each other. For the next few days, he frantically searched for news of my mother. On January 12th, they had found her body. Later, I found out she'd also survived the crash but was badly injured and couldn't move and died several days later. Abandoned in the desert, one man survives in the sanctuary and safety of the abandoned shrine. Mauro Perospi is an Italian police officer who gained worldwide fame after getting lost in the Sahara Desert in 1994. Mauro took part in the Marathon of the Sands in Morocco, a 6-day-long endurance race that's one of the driest and barren environments on the planet. As he passed his 3rd checkpoint on the 4th day, a sandstorm caused him to become disoriented and lose his way. He tries backtracking but remains lost and camps for the night. One day after going off track, he finds himself in an abandoned Merabah Muslim shrine in Algeria. In order to survive, he kills and eats lizards and bats. For fluid, he drinks his own urine and licks dew off of rocks. He also uses his urine to rehydrate and cook his freeze-dried food packs. Airplane after airplane passes overhead. He says he tries to signal by lighting a small fire and writing SOS in the sand, but planes continue over the horizon. Assuming he'll never be found, he attempts to take his own life, but in a twist of fate, the heat was so dry, his wounds clotted immediately, and he had no choice but to continue trying to live. For 9 days he walked through the desert, finding an oasis, chugging some water. It helped lead him to a small village. From there he was flown to a hospital where doctors say his liver had nearly completely failed. The story of a survivor betrayed by their country for doing exactly what they're asked to, claim for Canada. Alaska native Ada Blackjack was hired in 1921 by Canadians Vilhelmur Stephenson and Alan Crawford on an expedition to the Wrangel Islands. The goal at the time was to claim them in the name of Canada, and Blackjack was the seamstress and cook of the expedition. 5 members of the expedition were left on the island in 1921 as a territorial claim. For the first few years on Wrangel, Wrangel Island, the land lived up to Stephenson's promises, but as summer came to an end, the once plentiful game disappeared and the ice closed in with no sign of a ship. 3 members went off in search of help while Blackjack took care of an ailing crewmate who later perished, leaving her alone. By the time the rescue ship crested the horizon nearly 2 years later, Blackjack, who had become known as the female Robinson Crusoe, was the only member still alive apart from the cat Vic. She taught herself to set traps, taught herself to shoot birds, built a platform above her shelter to spot polar bears from, and crafted boats. She even experimented with the expedition's photography equipment. But unlike the other survivors in these stories, Blackjack did not receive a hero's welcome when she returned home. While Stephenson and the others profited off the story of the tragic expedition, Blackjack saw none of that money, and she was criticized for not saving the life of her crewmate. Horrifically, she spent the rest of her life in poverty before her death in 1983. I'm a lover of a throwback and vintage trends, but one trend we should never bring back: risking a hitchhike. Mary Vincent was with 2 other hitchhikers on September 29, 1978, looking for a ride to her grandpa's, when 50-year-old Lawrence Singleton pulls his van over and said he could only give her a ride, despite his noticeably empty van. Exhausted, Mary Vincent acted against her own instincts and climbed in this vehicle. Singleton knocks her out with a sledgehammer and proceeds to hold Mary and violate her throughout the night. The next morning, Lawrence drags Mary from his van with a hatchet. He cuts her arms at the elbow in an apparent attempt to prevent her body from being identified. Conscious but in shock and losing blood, Mary played dead. Believing it, Singleton threw her off a cliff and Mary landed 30 feet below. Naked and in pain, she fought off the urge to give in to death. She packed mud into her open arm wounds to stop the bleeding, and then climbed back up the 30-foot cliff and started walking down the road, holding her arms upright so she wouldn't bleed out. Even she stated she wasn't surprised the first car passed her, but the second one didn't. Lawrence Singleton was found guilty on a litany of crimes. However, due to very lenient sentencing laws for SA crimes at the time, Singleton was sentenced to just 14 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed, and he was out in 8. This led to the Singleton Bill, which stops the early release of perpetrators who commit a crime involving torment. Now, minimum sentence is 25 years. Devastatingly, Singleton went on to kill a 31-year-old mother of 3 named Roxanne Hayes in 1997, and Mary Vincent chose to testify in court against him nearly 20 years later again. He's now convicted and sentenced to death. And a story that feels like it unfolded from a movie script is the Gremlin Special. On May 13, 1945, the Gremlin Special, a U.S. Army Air Force cargo plane, crashed into the side of a mountain, killing all but 5 passengers. The next day, 2 of the survivors also died from their injuries. Those remaining were Margaret Hastings, Kenneth Decker, and John McCollum. Basic United States unknown terrain survival training during the Second World War wasn't exactly what you'd call advanced, so injured and terrified, they were actually very unsure as to what to do next. But the crash caused quite a bit of noise and set up a thick plume of smoke, making it easy to see for miles. And since the survivors of the crash were too weak to travel, they made pretty easy to find for the Danny clan. The crew of the Gremlin Special were the first people in the world outside of the other local clans, of course, to encounter the Dannies, a native people who had lived on the Shangri-La Valley for generations and were in fact known to eat other people. Lucky for our survivors, it's only people from their enemy clans during battles, and their first interaction with the clan's chief went as follows. There was a log running across this little gully, and he walked out on the log and I walked out on the log, and we got closer together, McCollum recalls. McCollum instructed his group to smile, and luckily the Danny leader smiled back. He finally got real close, and I reached out and grabbed his hand, and he grabbed mine, and from then on, we were all friends. The Dannies nursed the injured survivors back to health, looking after the 3 until May 17th. After spending 45 days in the jungle learning and growing with this new clan, a search and rescue plane dispatched to find the crash site of the Gremlin Special saw the 3 survivors near the wreck. It was a remarkable end to a remarkable story. Many years later, Hastings would tell an audience, "You have no choice, you have no fear. You just do what has to be done." That is, in many ways, the very definition of survival. Alright, thank you so much for tuning in, and I'm glad you enjoyed. Be sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more from us, and until next time, sometimes a cool trip, a great offer, or a little bit of adrenaline isn't worth risking your life.